Welcome to Midnight Murmurs. Tonight's tale is The Listener, a classic work of supernatural fiction by Algernon Blackwood. Rather than relying on monsters or sudden scares, this story slowly builds an atmosphere of unease where every ordinary sound and every quiet moment begins to feel wrong. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the darkness do the rest. This is The Listener. September 4. I have hunted all over London for rooms suited to my income of £120 a year and have at last found them. There are 2 rooms. They are without modern conveniences, it is true, and they are located in an old, ramshackle building, but they are within a stone's throw of P Place, in an eminently respectable street. The rent is only £25 a year. I had begun to despair when, at last, I found them by chance. The circumstances were unworthy of record. I had to sign a lease for a year, and I did so willingly. The furniture from our old place in Shire, which has been stored for so long, will suit them perfectly. October 1. Here I am in my 2 rooms in the center of London, not far from the offices of the periodicals where I occasionally manage to sell an article or 2. The building stands at the end of a cul-de-sac. The alley is well paved and clean, lined chiefly with the backs of sedate, institutional-looking buildings. There is also a stable. My own house is dignified with the title of Chambers. I feel as though, one day, the honor must prove too much for it. It will swell with pride and fall apart. It is very old. The floor of my sitting room has valleys and low hills upon it, and the top of the door slants away from the ceiling with a glorious disregard for what is usual. They must have quarreled 50 years ago and have been moving apart ever since. October 2. My landlady is old and thin, with a faded, dusty face. She is uncommunicative. The few words she utters seem to cost her pain. Perhaps her lungs are half choked with dust. She keeps my rooms as free from this substance as possible, with the assistance of a strong girl who brings up my breakfast and lights the fire. As I have already said, the landlady is not communicative. In response to my pleasant efforts at conversation, she informed me briefly that I was the only occupant of the house at present. My rooms had not been occupied for several years. There had been other gentlemen upstairs, but they had left. She never looks directly at me when she speaks. Instead, she fixes her dim eyes upon the middle button of my waistcoat until I become nervous and begin to wonder whether it is crooked or perhaps the wrong sort of button altogether. October 8th. My weekly account book is neatly kept and, so far, reasonable. Milk and sugar, 7 pence. Bread, 6 pence. Butter, 8 pence. Marmalade, 6 pence. Eggs, 1 shilling and 8 pence. Laundress, 2 shillings and 9 pence. Oil, 6 pence. Attendance, 5 shillings. The total is 12 shillings and 2 pence. The landlady has a son who, she told me, is something on a omnibus. He occasionally comes to see her. I think he drinks, because he talks very loudly, regardless of the hour, and tumbles about over the furniture downstairs. All morning, I sit indoors writing. I write articles, verses for comic papers, and a novel I have been working on for 3 years, concerning which I still have dreams. I am also writing a children's book, in which the imagination has free rein, and another book that is intended to last as long as I do. It is an honest record of my soul's advance or retreat in the struggle of life. Besides these, I keep a book of poems that I use as a safety valve, and concerning which I have no dreams whatsoever. Between them all, I am always occupied. In the afternoons, I generally try to take a walk for the sake of my health. I walk through Regent's Park, into Kensington Gardens, or farther afield to Hampstead Heath. October 10. Everything went wrong today. I have 2 eggs for breakfast. This morning, one of them was bad. I rang the bell for Emily. When she came in, I was reading the newspaper. Without looking up, I said, "The egg is bad." "Oh, is it, sir?" she replied. "I'll get another one." She went out, taking the egg with her. I waited for her return, which came 5 minutes later. She placed the new egg on the table and went away. But when I looked down, I saw that she had taken away the good egg and left the bad one, all green and yellow, in the slop basin. I rang again. "You've taken the wrong egg," I said. "Oh!" she exclaimed. "I thought the one I took downstairs didn't smell so very bad." In due time, she returned with the good egg. I resumed my breakfast with 2 eggs, but considerably less appetite. It was all very trivial, to be sure, but it was so stupid that I felt annoyed. The character of that egg influenced everything I did. I wrote a bad article and tore it up. I developed a bad headache. I used bad words to myself. Everything was bad. So, I abandoned my work and went for a long walk. I dined at a cheap chop house on my way back and reached home at approximately 9 o'clock. Rain was beginning to fall as I entered, and the wind was rising. It promised to be an ugly night. The alley looked dismal and dreary. The hall of the house felt as chilly as a tomb when I passed through it. It was the first stormy night I had experienced in my new quarters. The drafts were awful. They came crisscrossing through the room, meeting in the middle and forming eddies, whirlpools, and cold, silent currents that almost lifted the hair from my head. I stuffed the window frames with neckties and odd socks, then sat over the smoky fire in my greatcoat to keep warm. At first I tried to write, but it was too cold. My hand turned to ice upon the paper. What tricks the wind played with the old place? It came rushing up the forsaken alley with a sound like the feet of a hurrying crowd, stopping suddenly outside the door. I felt as though a group of curious people had arranged themselves just outside and were staring up at my windows. Then they took to their heels again, fleeing down the lane in whispers and laughter, only to return with the next gust of wind and repeat their impertinence. On the other side of my room, a single square window opened into a narrow shaft, or well, measuring approximately 6 feet across to the back wall of another house. The wind dropped down this funnel, puffing and shouting. I had never heard such noises before. Between these two entertainments, I sat over the fire in my greatcoat and listened to the deep booming in the chimney. It was like being aboard a ship at sea. I almost expected the floor to rise in waves and rock back and forth beneath me. October 12th. I wish I were not quite so lonely and so poor, yet I love both my loneliness and my poverty. The former makes me appreciate the companionship of the wind and rain. The latter preserves my liver and prevents me from wasting time dancing attendance upon women. Poor, badly dressed men are not considered acceptable attendants. My parents are dead, and my only sister is not dead, exactly, but married to a very rich man. They travel most of the time. He travels to recover his health, while she travels to lose herself. Through sheer neglect on her part, she has long since passed out of my life. The door closed when, after an absolute silence of 5 years, she sent me a check for £50 at Christmas. It was signed by her husband. I returned it to her in 1,000 pieces, enclosed in an unstamped envelope. At least I had the satisfaction of knowing that it cost her something. She wrote back with a broad quill pen that covered an entire page with 3 lines. "You are evidently as cracked as ever, and rude and ungrateful into the bargain." It had always been my greatest fear that the insanity in my father's family might leap across the generations and appear in me. This thought haunted me, and she knew it. After this little exchange of civilities, the door slammed shut, never to open again. I heard the crash it made. With it came the sound of many little pieces of china falling from the walls of my heart. Some of it was rare china, possessing its own peculiar value. It had only needed dusting. Those same walls had once held mirrors in which I sometimes saw reflected the misty lawns of childhood, daisy chains, wind-torn blossoms scattered through the orchard by warm rain. the robber's cave along the old path, and the secret store of apples in the hayloft. My sister had been my inseparable companion then, but when the door slammed, the mirrors cracked across their entire length, and the visions they held vanished forever. Now I am quite alone. At 40, one cannot begin again and carefully construct new friendships. All others seem comparatively worthless. October 14. My bedroom measures 10 feet by 10 feet. It lies below the level of the front room, and a single step leads down into it. Both rooms are very quiet on calm nights because there is no traffic along this forsaken alleyway. Despite the occasional tricks of the wind, it is a sheltered little strip. At its upper end, beneath my windows, all the cats of the neighborhood congregate as soon as darkness gathers. They lie undisturbed upon the long ledge of a blind window in the opposite building. After the postman has come and gone at 9:30, no footsteps ever interrupt their sinister gathering. There is no step but my own, or occasionally the unsteady footfall of the son who is some think on a omnibus. October 15. I dined at an ABC shop on poached eggs and coffee, then went for a stroll around the outer edge of Regent's Park. It was 10 o'clock when I returned home. I counted no fewer than 13 cats, all dark in color, crouching along the sheltered side of the alley walls. It was a cold night. The stars shone like points of ice in a blue-black sky. The cats turned their heads and stared at me in silence as I passed. An odd sensation of shyness took possession of me beneath the glare of so many pairs of unblinking eyes. As I fumbled with the latchkey, the cats jumped noiselessly down and pressed against my legs, as though anxious to be allowed inside. But I slammed the door in their faces and hurried upstairs. When I entered the front room and began groping for the matches, it felt as cold as a stone vault. The air also possessed an unusual dampness. October 17. For several days, I have been working on a ponderous article that permits no play of the imagination. My imagination requires a careful rein. I am afraid to let it loose, because it sometimes carries me into appalling places beyond the stars and beneath the world. No one understands the danger better than I do. But what a foolish thing to write here. There is no one to know, no one to understand. My mind has lately entertained unusual thoughts. They are thoughts I have never experienced before concerning medicines, drugs, and the treatment of strange illnesses. I cannot imagine their source. At no previous time in my life have I dwelt upon such ideas, yet now they constantly crowd my mind. I have taken no exercise lately because the weather has been dreadful. My afternoons have been spent in the reading room of the British Museum, where I possess a reader's ticket. I have also made an unpleasant discovery. There are rats in the house. At night, while lying in bed, I hear them scampering across the hills and valleys of the front room. My sleep has been considerably disturbed as a result. October 24. Last night, the son who is some think on a omnibus came to the house. He had evidently been drinking, because I heard loud and angry voices in the kitchen long after I had gone to bed. At one point, I caught several peculiar words rising through the floor. Burning from top to bottom is the only thing that'll ever make this house right. I knocked upon the floor, and the voices stopped abruptly. Later, however, I heard their clamor again in my dreams. These rooms are very quiet. Sometimes they are almost too quiet. On windless nights, they are as silent as the grave, and the house might be miles away in the countryside. The roar of London traffic reaches me only as a series of heavy, distant vibrations. At times, it carries an ominous note, like the approach of an army or an immense tidal wave thundering in the night from very far away. October 27. Mrs. Monson, though admirably silent, is a foolish and fussy woman. She does such stupid things. When dusting the room, she places all my belongings in the wrong locations. The ashtrays, which belong on the writing table, she arranges in a silly row upon the mantelpiece. The pen tray, which should be beside the inkstand, she cleverly hides among the books upon my reading desk. My gloves she arranges every day in an idiotic display upon a half-filled bookshelf. I am always forced to return them to the low table beside the door. She places my armchair at impossible angles between the fire and the light. The tablecloth, the one stained at Trinity Hall, she puts upon the table in such a way that, whenever I look at it, I feel as though my tie and all my clothing have become crooked and disordered. She exasperates me. Her silence and meekness are irritating. Sometimes I feel inclined to throw the inkstand at her, merely to bring an expression into those watery eyes and a squeak from those colorless lips. Dear me! What violent expressions I am using! How foolish of me! And yet, it almost seems as though the words are not my own, but have been spoken directly into my ear. I mean that I do not naturally use such terms. October 30. I have been here for 1 month. I do not think the place agrees with me. My headaches are becoming more frequent and violent, and my nerves are a perpetual source of discomfort and annoyance. I have developed a great dislike for Mrs. Monson, a feeling I am certain she returns. Frequently, I receive the impression that things happen within this house of which I know nothing, and which she is careful to conceal from me. Last night her son slept in the house. This morning, while standing at the window, I watched him leave. He glanced upward and caught my eye. I saw a loutish figure and a singularly repulsive face. He gave me the benefit of a very unpleasant leer. At least, that is what I imagined. November 2. The complete stillness of this house is beginning to oppress me. I wish there were other fellows living upstairs. No footsteps ever sound above me. No one passes my door to climb the next flight of stairs. I am beginning to feel curious about the upper rooms. I should like to go upstairs and see what they are like. I feel lonely and isolated here, as though I have been swept into a deserted corner of the world and forgotten. Once, I caught myself gazing into the long, cracked mirrors, trying to see sunlight dancing beneath the trees of the orchard, but only deep shadows gathered there now. I quickly looked away. It has been dark all day, without a breath of wind. The fogs have begun. I was forced to use a reading lamp throughout the morning. There was no cart to be heard today. I actually missed it. In the gloom and silence, I think I might almost have welcomed it. After all, the sound is a human one. This empty house, at the end of the alley, contains other sounds that are not quite so satisfactory. I have never once seen a policeman in the lane. The postmen always hurry away, showing no desire to linger. 10 o'clock at night. As I write, I hear no sound except the deep murmur of distant traffic and the low sighing of the wind. The two sounds blend together. Now and then, a cat raises its shrill, uncanny cry into the darkness. The cats are always beneath my windows after nightfall. The wind drops into the narrow shaft outside with a noise like the sudden sweeping of immense wings far away. It is a dreary night. I feel lost and forgotten. November 3. From my windows, I can observe anyone who arrives. When someone comes to the front door, I can just see a hat, a pair of shoulders, and a hand upon the bell. Only 2 fellows have visited me since I arrived 2 months ago. I saw both of them from the window before they came upstairs. I heard their voices asking whether I was at home. Neither of them ever returned. I have finished the ponderous article. Upon reading it through, however, I found myself dissatisfied and drew my pencil through almost every page. There were strange expressions and ideas within it that I could not explain. I viewed them with amazement, not to say alarm. They did not sound like my own thoughts, and I could not remember writing them. Can it be that my memory is beginning to fail? My pens are never where I leave them. That stupid old woman places them in a different location every day. I must give her credit for finding so many new hiding places. Such ingenuity is remarkable. I have told her repeatedly, but she always says, "I'll speak to Emily, sir." Emily always says, "I'll tell Mrs. Monson, sir." Their foolishness makes me irritable and scatters my thoughts. I should like to stick the lost pens into them, blind their eyes, and turn them outside to be scratched and mauled by those 1,000 hungry cats. What a ghastly thought! Where in the world did it come from? Such an idea is no more my own than it belongs to some policeman. Yet I felt compelled to write it. It was like a voice singing inside my head, and my pen refused to stop until the final word had been written. What ridiculous nonsense! I must restrain myself. I will restrain myself. I must take more regular exercise. My nerves and liver are troubling me horribly. November 4. I attended a curious lecture in the French Quarter concerning death. The room was so hot and I was so weary that I fell asleep. The only part I heard, however, touched my imagination vividly. Speaking of suicides, the lecturer declared that self-murder provided no escape from the miseries of the present. It merely prepared greater sorrow for the future. Suicides, he said, cannot so easily escape their responsibilities. They must return to life at precisely the point where they violently abandoned it, but with the added pain and punishment caused by their weakness. Many of them wander the earth in unspeakable misery until they can clothe themselves again in the body of another person. They generally choose a lunatic or weak-minded individual who cannot resist the hideous obsession. This is their only means of escape. What a weird and horrible idea! I wish I had remained asleep and had not heard it at all. My mind is already morbid enough without such ghastly fancies. Such dangerous propaganda should be stopped by the police. I shall write to the Times and suggest it. A good idea. I walked home through Greek Street in Soho and imagined that 100 years had slipped backward into place. De Quincey was still there, haunting the night with invocations to his just, subtle, and mighty drug. His vast dreams seemed to hover nearby. Once the pictures had begun inside my brain, they refused to disappear. I saw him sleeping in that cold and tenantless mansion beside the strange little waif who feared its ghosts, both hidden beneath a single horseman's cloak. I saw him wandering in the company of the spectral Anne. Later, I saw him traveling toward the eternal meeting she was never able to keep. What unutterable gloom! What untold horror of sorrow and suffering comes over me when I try to understand what that man, who was then only a boy, must have carried inside his lonely heart. As I came up the alley, I saw a light in the highest window. The shadow of a head and shoulders appeared in exaggerated proportions upon the blind. I wondered what the landlady's son could be doing up there at such an hour. November 5. This morning, while I was writing, someone climbed the creaking stairs and knocked cautiously upon my door. Believing it to be the landlady, I called, "Come in!" The knock was repeated. I called more loudly, "Come in! Come in!" But no one turned the handle. I continued writing, muttering under my breath, "Well, stay outside then." At least, I attempted to continue. My thoughts had suddenly dried up at their source. I could not write a single word. It was a dark morning, filled with yellow fog, and there was little enough inspiration in the air already. But the thought of that stupid woman standing outside my door, waiting to be invited inside yet again, produced a feeling of irritation that filled my mind to the exclusion of everything else. At last, I jumped up and opened the door myself. "What do you want? And why in the world don't you come in?" I cried. But the words fell into empty air. There was no one there. The fog poured up the dingy staircase in deep yellow coils, but there was no sign of another human being anywhere. I slammed the door, uttering curses against the house and its noises, and returned to my work. A few minutes later, Emily entered with a letter. "Were you or Mrs. Monson outside my door a few minutes ago, knocking?" "No, sir." "Are you certain?" "Mrs. Monson has gone to market. There's no one but me and the child in the whole house. I've been washing dishes for the last hour, sir." I imagined that the girl's face became slightly paler. She moved uneasily toward the door, glancing over her shoulder. "Wait, Emily," I said. I told her what I had heard. She stared stupidly at me, although her eyes moved occasionally over the objects in the room. "Who was it?" I asked when I had finished. Mrs. Monson says it's only mice, she replied, as though repeating a lesson she had memorized. Mice? I exclaimed. It was nothing of the sort. Someone was feeling around outside my door. Who was it? Is the son in the house? Her entire manner changed. She suddenly became earnest, rather than evasive. She appeared anxious to tell me the truth. Oh, no, sir. There's no one in the house but you, me, and the child. There couldn't have been anybody at your door. As for those knocks, she stopped abruptly, as though she had already said too much. Well, what about the knocks? I asked more gently. Of course, she stammered. The knocks aren't mice, and neither are the footsteps. But then, again, she stopped completely. Is there something wrong with the house? Lord, no, sir. The drains are splendid. I don't mean the drains, girl. I mean, did anything bad ever happen here? She flushed to the roots of her hair, then suddenly turned pale again. She was clearly in considerable distress. There was something she wanted to tell me, yet was afraid to reveal. Some forbidden matter she had been ordered not to mention. I do not mind what it was, I said encouragingly. I should simply like to know. She raised her frightened eyes to my face. She began to blurt out something concerning that which happened once to a gentleman who lived upstairs. Then a shrill voice called her name from below. Emily! Emily! It was the returning landlady. The girl tumbled downstairs as though an invisible rope had pulled her backward. She left me filled with questions about what could possibly have happened to a gentleman upstairs that might, in so peculiar a manner, affect my ears downstairs. The mystery has only just begun. An empty house, strange noises, a frightened servant, and a secret that no one seems willing to speak aloud. In part 2, the writer's unease deepens as the house reveals more of its unsettling nature, leading him closer to the truth hidden above his rooms. November 10. I have done capital work, have finished the ponderous article, and had it accepted for the review, and another one ordered. I feel well and cheerful, and have had regular exercise and good sleep. No headaches, no nerves, no liver. Those pills the chemist recommended are wonderful. Even the gray-faced landlady rouses pity in me. I am sorry for her. So worn, so weary, so oddly put together, just like the building. She looks as if she had once suffered some shock of terror, and was momentarily dreading another. When I spoke to her today very gently about not putting the pens in the ashtray and the gloves on the bookshelf, she raised her faint eyes to mine for the first time, and said with the ghost of a smile, I'll try and remember, sir. I felt inclined to pat her on the back and say, Come, cheer up and be jolly. Life's not so bad after all. Oh, I am much better. There's nothing like open air and success and good sleep. They build up as if by magic, the portions of the heart eaten down by despair and unsatisfied yearnings. Even to the cats, I feel friendly. When I came in at 11 o'clock tonight, they followed me to the door in a stream, and I stooped down to stroke the one nearest to me. Bah! The brute hissed and spat, and struck at me with her paws. The claw caught my hand, and drew blood in a thin line. The others danced sideways into the darkness, screeching as though I had done them an injury. I believe these cats really hate me. Perhaps they are only waiting to be reinforced. Then they will attack me. Ha ha. In spite of the momentary annoyance, this fancy sent me laughing upstairs to my room. The fire was out, and the room seemed unusually cold. As I groped my way over to the mantelpiece to find the matches, I realized all at once that there was another person standing beside me in the darkness. I could, of course, see nothing, but my fingers, feeling along the ledge, came into forcible contact with something that was at once withdrawn. It was cold and moist. I could have sworn it was somebody's hand. My flesh began to creep instantly. Who's that? I exclaimed in a loud voice. My voice dropped into the silence like a pebble into a deep well. There was no answer, but at the same moment I heard someone moving away from me across the room in the direction of the door. It was a confused sort of footstep, and the sound of garments brushing the furniture on the way. The same second my hand stumbled upon the matchbox, and I struck a light. I expected to see Mrs. Monson, or Emily, or perhaps the son who is something on an omnibus, but the flare of the gas jet illumined an empty room. There was not a sign of a person anywhere. I felt the hair stir upon my head, and instinctively I backed up against the wall, lest something should approach me from behind. I was distinctly alarmed, but the next minute I recovered myself. The door was open onto the landing, and I crossed the room, not without some inward trepidation, and went out. The light from the room fell upon the stairs, but there was no one to be seen anywhere, nor was there any sound on the creaking wooden staircase to indicate a departing creature. I was in the act of turning to go in again, when a sound overhead caught my ear. It was a very faint sound, not unlike the sigh of wind, yet it could not have been the wind, for the night was still as the grave. Though it was not repeated, I resolved to go upstairs and see for myself what it all meant. 2 senses had been affected, touch and hearing, and I could not believe that I had been deceived. So, with a lighted candle, I went stealthily forth on my unpleasant journey into the upper regions of this queer little old house. On the first landing there was only one door, and it was locked. On the second there was also only one door, but when I turned the handle it opened. There came forth to meet me the chill, musty air that is characteristic of a long, unoccupied room. With it there came an indescribable odor. I use the adjective advisedly. Though very faint, diluted as it were, it was nevertheless an odor that made my gorge rise. I had never smelt anything like it before, and I cannot describe it. The room was small and square, close under the roof, with a sloping ceiling and 2 tiny windows. It was cold as the grave, without a shred of carpet or a stick of furniture. The icy atmosphere and the nameless odor combined to make the room abominable to me, and after lingering a moment to see that it contained no cupboards or corners into which a person might have crept for concealment, I made haste to shut the door and went downstairs again to bed. Evidently I had been deceived after all as to the noise. In the night I had a foolish but very vivid dream. I dreamed that the landlady and another person, dark and not properly visible, entered my room on all fours, followed by a horde of immense cats. They attacked me as I lay in bed and murdered me, and then dragged my body upstairs and deposited it on the floor of that cold little square room under the roof. November 11. Since my talk with Emily, the unfinished talk, I have hardly once set eyes on her. Mrs. Monson now attends wholly to my wants. As usual, she does everything exactly as I don't like it done. It is all too utterly trivial to mention, but it is exceedingly irritating. Like small doses of morphine often repeated, she has finely accumulative effect. November 12. This morning I woke early and came into the front room to get a book, meaning to read in bed till it was time to get up. Emily was laying the fire. "Good morning," I said cheerfully. "Mind you make a good fire. It's very cold." The girl turned and showed me a startled face. It was not Emily at all. "Where's Emily?" I exclaimed. "You mean the girl as was ere before me? Has Emily left?" "I came on the 6th," she replied sullenly, "and she'd gone then. I got my book and went back to bed." Emily must have been sent away almost immediately after our conversation. This reflection kept coming between me and the printed page. I was glad when it was time to get up. Such prompt energy, such merciless decision, seemed to argue something of importance to somebody. November 13. The wound inflicted by the cat's claw has swollen, and causes me annoyance and some pain. It throbs and itches. I'm afraid my blood must be in poor condition, or it would have healed by now. I opened it with a penknife soaked in an antiseptic solution, and cleaned it thoroughly. I have heard unpleasant stories of the results of wounds inflicted by cats. November 14. In spite of the curious effect this house certainly exercises upon my nerves, I like it. It is lonely and deserted in the very heart of London, but it is also for that reason quiet to work in. I wonder why it is so cheap. Some people might be suspicious, but I did not even ask the reason. No answer is better than a lie. If only I could remove the cats from the outside and the rats from the inside. I feel that I shall grow accustomed more and more to its peculiarities and shall die here. Ah, that expression reads queerly and gives a wrong impression. I meant live and die here. I shall renew the lease from year to year till one of us crumbles to pieces. From present indications, the building will be the first to go. Ah, November 16. This morning, I woke to find my clothes scattered about the room, and a cane chair overturned beside the bed. My coat and waistcoat looked just as if they had been tried on by someone in the night. I had horribly vivid dreams too, in which someone covering his face with his hands kept coming close up to me, crying out as if in pain. Where can I find covering? Oh, who will clothe me? How silly, and yet it frightened me a little. It was so dreadfully real. It is now over a year since I last walked in my sleep and woke up with such a shock on the cold pavement of Earl's Court Road, where I then lived. I thought I was cured, but evidently not. This discovery has rather a disquieting effect upon me. Tonight I shall resort to the old trick of tying my toe to the bedpost. Thank you. November 17. Last night I was again troubled by most oppressive dreams. Someone seemed to be moving in the night up and down my room, sometimes passing into the front room, and then returning to stand beside the bed and stare intently down upon me. I was being watched by this person all night long. I never actually awoke, though I was often very near it. I suppose it was a nightmare from indigestion, for this morning I have one of my old vile headaches. Yet all my clothes lay about the floor when I awoke, where they had evidently been flung had I tossed them during the dark hours, and my trousers trailed over the step into the front room. Worse than this, though, I fancied I noticed about the room in the morning that strange fetid odor. Though very faint, its mere suggestion is foul and nauseating. What in the world can it be? I wonder. In future, I shall lock my door. I have accomplished a lot of good work during this past week, and have also managed to get regular exercise. I have felt well and in an equable state of mind. Only two things have occurred to disturb my equanimity. The first is trivial in itself, and no doubt to be easily explained. The upper window, where I saw the light on the night of November 4th, with the shadow of a large head and shoulder upon the blind, is one of the windows in the square room under the roof. In reality, it has no blind at all. Here is the other thing. I was coming home last night in a fresh fall of snow about 11 o'clock, my umbrella low down over my head. Halfway up the alley, where the snow was wholly untrodden, I saw a man's legs in front of me. The umbrella hid the rest of his figure, but on raising it I saw that he was tall and broad and was walking, as I was, towards the door of my house. He could not have been 4 feet ahead of me. I had thought the alley was empty when I entered it, but might of course been mistaken very easily. A sudden gust of wind compelled me to lower the umbrella, and when I raised it again, not half a minute later, there was no longer any man to be seen. With a few more steps, I reached the door. It was closed as usual. I then noticed with a sudden sensation of dismay that the surface of the freshly fallen snow was unbroken. My own footmarks were the only ones to be seen anywhere, and though I retraced my way to the point where I had first seen the man, I could find no slightest impression of any other boots. Feeling creepy and uncomfortable, I went upstairs and was glad to get into bed. On November 28, with the fastening of my bedroom door, the disturbances ceased. I am convinced that I walked in my sleep. Probably I untied my toe and then tied it up again. The fancied security of the locked door would alone have been enough to restore sleep to my troubled spirit and enable me to rest quietly. Last night, however, the annoyance was suddenly renewed in another and more aggressive form. I woke in the darkness with the impression that someone was standing outside my bedroom door listening. As I became more awake, the impression grew into positive knowledge. Though there was no appreciable sound of moving or breathing, I was so convinced of the propinquity of a listener that I crept out of bed and approached the door. As I did so, there came faintly from the next room the unmistakable sound of someone retreating stealthily across the floor. Yet, as I heard it, it was neither the tread of a man nor a regular footstep, but rather, it seemed to me, a confused sort of crawling, almost as of someone on his hands and knees. I unlocked the door in less than a second and passed quickly into the front room, and I could feel, as by the subtlest imaginable vibrations upon my nerves, that the spot I was standing in had just that instant been vacated. The listener had moved. He was now behind the other door, standing in the passage. Yet this door was also closed. I moved swiftly and as silently as possible across the floor and turned the handle. A cold rush of air met me from the passage and sent shiver after shiver down my back. There was no one in the doorway. There was no one on the little landing. There was no one moving down the staircase. Yet I had been so quick that this midnight listener could not be very far away, and I felt that if I persevered, I should eventually come face to face with him. And the courage that came so opportunely to overcome my nervousness and horror seemed born of the unwilling conviction that it was somehow necessary for my safety, as well as my sanity, that I should find this intruder and force his secret from him. For was it not the intent action of his mind upon my own, in concentrated listening, that had awakened me with such a vivid realization of his presence? Advancing across the narrow landing, I peered down into the well of the little house. There was nothing to be seen. No one was moving in the darkness. How cold the oilcloth was to my bare feet! I cannot say what it was that suddenly drew my eyes upward. I only know that, without apparent reason, I looked up and saw a person about halfway up the next turn of the stairs, leaning forward over the balustrade and staring straight into my face. It was a man. He appeared to be clinging to the rail rather than standing on the stairs. The gloom made it impossible to see much beyond the general outline, but the head and shoulders were seemingly enormous and stood sharply silhouetted against the skylight in the roof immediately above. The idea flashed into my brain in a moment that I was looking into the visage of something monstrous. The huge skull, the mane-like hair, the wide humped shoulders, suggested, in a way I did not pause to analyze, that which was scarcely human, and for some seconds, fascinated by horror, I returned the gaze and stared into the dark, inscrutable countenance above me, without knowing exactly where I was or what I was doing. Then I realized in quite a new way that I was face to face with the secret midnight listener, and I steeled myself as best I could for what was about to come. The source of the rash courage that came to me at this awful moment will ever be to me an inexplicable mystery. Though shivering with fear, and my forehead wet with an unholy dew, I resolved to advance. 20 questions leaped to my lips. What are you? What do you want? Why do you listen and watch? Why do you come into my room? But none of them found articulate utterance. I began forthwith to climb the stairs, and with the first signs of my advance he drew himself back into the shadows and began to move too. He retreated as swiftly as I advanced. I heard the sound of his crawling motion a few steps ahead of me, ever maintaining the same distance. When I reached the landing he was halfway up the next flight, and when I was halfway up the next flight he had already arrived at the top landing. And then I heard him open the door of the little square room under the roof and go in. Immediately, though the door did not close after him, the sound of his moving entirely ceased. At this moment I longed for a light, or a stick, or any weapon whatsoever. But I had none of these things, and it was impossible to go back. So I marched steadily up the rest of the stairs, and in less than a minute found myself standing in the gloom, face to face with the door through which this creature had just entered. For a moment I hesitated. The door was about halfway open, and the listener was standing, evidently in his favorite attitude, just behind it, listening. To search through that dark room for him seemed hopeless. To enter the same small space where he was seemed horrible. The very idea filled me with loathing. and I almost decided to turn back. It is strange at such times how trivial things impinge on the consciousness with a shock as of something important and immense. Something, it might have been a beetle or a mouse, scuttled over the bare boards behind me. The door moved a quarter of an inch, closing. My decision came back with a sudden rush, as it were, and thrusting out a foot, I kicked the door so that it swung sharply back to its full extent, and permitted me to walk forward slowly into the aperture of profound blackness beyond. What a queer, soft sound my bare feet made on the boards! How the blood sang and buzzed in my head! I was inside. The darkness closed over me, hiding even the windows. I groped my way round the walls in a thorough search, but in order to prevent all possibility of the other's escape, I first of all closed the door. There we were, we two, shut in together between four walls, within a few feet of one another. But with what, with whom, was I thus momentarily imprisoned? A new light flashed suddenly over the affair with a swift, illuminating brilliance, and I knew I was a fool, an utter fool. I was wide awake, at last, and the horror was evaporating. My cursed nerves again, a dream, a nightmare, and the old result walking in my sleep. The figure was a dream figure. Many a time before had the actors in my dreams stood before me for some moments after I was awake. There was a chance match in my pajamas pocket, and I struck it on the wall. The room was utterly empty. It held not even a shadow. I went quickly down to bed, cursing my wretched nerves and my foolish, vivid dreams. But as soon as ever I was asleep again, the same uncouth figure of a man crept back to my bedside, and bending over me with his immense head close to my ear, whispered repeatedly in my dreams, "I want your body. I want its covering. I am waiting for it and listening always." Words scarcely less foolish than the dream. But I wonder what that queer odor was up in the square room. I noticed it again, and stronger than ever before, and it seemed to be also in my bedroom when I woke this morning. Why, November 29. Slowly, as moonbeams rise over a misty sea in June, the thought is entering my mind that my nerves and somnambulistic dreams do not adequately account for the influence this house exercises upon me. It holds me as with a fine, invisible net. I cannot escape if I would. It draws me, and it means to keep me. Why, November 30. The post this morning brought me a letter from Aidan, forwarded from my old rooms in Earl's Court. It was from Chapter, my former Trinity chum, who was on his way home from the East and asked for my address. I sent it to him at the hotel he mentioned to await arrival. As I have already said, my windows command a view of the alley, and I can see an arrival without difficulty. This morning, while I was busy writing, the sound of footsteps coming up the alley filled me with a sense of vague alarm that I could in no way account for. I went over to the window and saw a man standing below, waiting for the door to be opened. His shoulders were broad, his top hat glossy, and his overcoat fitted beautifully round the collar. All this I could see, but no more. Presently the door opened, and the shock to my nerves was unmistakable when I heard a man's voice ask, "Is Mr. still here?" mentioning my name. I could not catch the answer, but it could only have been in the affirmative, for the man entered the hall, and the door shut to behind him. But I waited in vain for the sound of his steps on the stairs. There was no sound of any kind. It seemed to me so strange that I opened my door and looked out. No one was anywhere to be seen. I walked across the narrow landing and looked through the window that commands the whole length of the alley. There was no sign of a human being, coming or going. The lane was deserted. Then I deliberately walked downstairs into the kitchen and asked the gray-faced landlady if a gentleman had just that minute called for me. The answer, given with an odd, weary sort of smile, was, "No." December 1. I feel genuinely alarmed and uneasy over the state of my nerves. Dreams are dreams, but never before have I had dreams in broad daylight. I am looking forward very much to Chapter's arrival. He is a capital fellow, vigorous, healthy, with no nerves, and even less imagination, and he has £2,000 a year into the bargain. Periodically, he makes me offers. The last was to travel around the world with him as secretary, which was a delicate way of paying my expenses and giving me some pocket money offers, however, which I invariably decline. I prefer to keep his friendship. Women could not come between us. Money might, therefore I give it no opportunity. Chapter always laughed at what he called my fancies, being himself possessed only of that thin-blooded quality of imagination which is ever associated with the prosaic-minded man. Yet, if taunted with this obvious lack, his wrath is deeply stirred. His psychology is that of the crass materialist, always a rather funny article. It will afford me genuine relief, none the less, to hear the cold judgment his mind will have to pass upon the story of this house as I shall have it to tell. And December 2. The strangest part of it all I have not referred to in this brief diary. Truth to tell, I have been afraid to set it down in black and white. I have kept it in the background of my thoughts, preventing it as far as possible from taking shape. In spite of my efforts, however, it has continued to grow stronger. Now that I come to face the issue squarely, it is harder to express than I imagined. Like a half-remembered melody that trips in the head but vanishes the moment you try to sing it, these thoughts form a group in the background of my mind, behind my mind, as it were, and refuse to come forward. They are crouching, ready to spring, but the actual leap never takes place. In these rooms, except when my mind is strongly concentrated on my own work, I find myself suddenly dealing in thoughts and ideas that are not my own. New, strange conceptions, wholly foreign to my temperament, are forever cropping up in my head. What precisely they are is of no particular importance. The point is that they are entirely apart from the channel in which my thoughts have hitherto been accustomed to flow. Especially they come when my mind is at rest unoccupied, when I'm dreaming over the fire or sitting with a book which fails to hold my attention. Then these thoughts which are not mine spring into life and make me feel exceedingly uncomfortable. Sometimes they are so strong that I almost feel as if someone were in the room beside me thinking aloud. Evidently, my nerves and liver are shockingly out of order. I must work harder and take more vigorous exercise. The horrid thoughts never come when my mind is much occupied, but they are always there waiting, and, as it were, alive. What I have attempted to describe above came first upon me gradually after I had been some days in the house, and then grew steadily in strength. The other strange thing has come to me only twice in all these weeks. It appalls me. It is the consciousness of the propinquity of some deadly and loathsome disease. It comes over me like a wave of fever heat and then passes off, leaving me cold and trembling. The air seems for a few seconds to become tainted. So penetrating and convincing is the thought of this sickness that on both occasions my brain has turned momentarily dizzy, and through my mind, like flames of white heat, have flashed the ominous names of all the dangerous illnesses I know. I can no more explain these visitations than I can fly. Yet I know there is no dreaming about the clammy skin and palpitating heart which they always leave as witnesses of their brief visit. Most strongly of all was I aware of this nearness of a mortal sickness when, on the night of the 28th, I went upstairs in pursuit of the listening figure. When we were shut in together in that little square room under the roof, I felt that I was face to face with the actual essence of this invisible and malignant disease. Such a feeling never entered my heart before, and I pray to God it never may again. There! Now I have confessed. I have given some expression, at least, to the feelings that so far I have been afraid to see in my own writing. For since I can no longer deceive myself, the experiences of that night, 28th, were no more a dream than my daily breakfast is a dream. And the trivial entry in this diary, by which I sought to explain away an occurrence that caused me unutterable horror, was due solely to my desire not to acknowledge in words what I really felt and believed to be true. The increase that would have accrued to my horror by so doing might have been more than I could stand. And December 3. I wish chapter would come. My facts are already marshaled, and I can see his cool gray eyes fixed incredulously on my face as I relate them. The knocking at my door, the well-dressed caller, the light in the upper window and the shadow upon the blind, the man who preceded me in the snow, the scattering of my clothes at night, Emily's arrested confession, the landlady's suspicious reticence, the midnight listener on the stairs, and those awful subsequent words in my sleep. And above all, and hardest to tell, the presence of the abominable sickness and the stream of thoughts and ideas that are not my own. I can see Chapter's face, and I can almost hear his deliberate words. You've been at the tea again, and underfeeding, I expect, as usual. Better see my nerve doctor, and then come with me to the south of France. For this fellow, who knows nothing of disordered liver or high-strung nerves, goes regularly to a great nerve specialist with the periodical belief that his nervous system is beginning to decay. December 5. Ever since the incident of the listener, I have kept a nightlight burning in my bedroom, and my sleep has been undisturbed. Last night, however, I was subjected to a far worse annoyance. I woke suddenly and saw a man in front of the dressing table regarding himself in the mirror. The door was locked, as usual. I knew at once it was the listener, and the blood turned to ice in my veins. Such a wave of horror and dread swept over me that it seemed to turn me rigid in the bed, and I could neither move nor speak. I noted, however, that the odor I so abhorred was strong in the room. The man seemed to be tall and broad. He was stooping forward over the mirror. His back was turned to me, but in the glass I saw the reflection of a huge head and face illumined fitfully by the flicker of the nightlight. The spectral gray of very early morning stealing in round the edges of the curtains lent an additional horror to the picture, for it fell upon the hair that was tawny and mane-like, hanging about a face whose swollen, rugose features bore the once seen, never forgotten leonine expression of "I dare not write down that awful word." But, by way of corroborative proof, I saw in the faint mingling of the two lights that there were several bronze-colored blotches on the cheeks which the man was evidently examining with great care in the glass. The lips were pale and very thick and large. One hand I could not see, but the other rested on the ivory back of my hairbrush. Its muscles were strangely contracted, the fingers thin to emaciation, the back of the hand closely puckered up. It was like a big gray spider crouching to spring, or the claw of a great bird. The full realization that I was alone in the room with this nameless creature, almost within arm's reach of him, overcame me to such a degree that, when he suddenly turned and regarded me with small, beady eyes, wholly out of proportion to the grandeur of their massive setting, I sat bolt upright in bed, uttered a loud cry, and then fell back in a dead swoon of terror upon the bed. 1. December 6. When I came to this morning, the first thing I noticed was that my clothes were strewn all over the floor. I find it difficult to put my thoughts together, and have sudden accesses of violent trembling. I determined that I would go at once to Chapter's hotel and find out when he is expected. I cannot refer to what happened in the night. It is too awful, and I have to keep my thoughts rigorously away from it. I feel lightheaded and queer, couldn't eat any breakfast, and have twice vomited with blood. While dressing to go out, a hansom rattled up noisily over the cobbles, and a minute later the door opened, and to my great joy in walked the very subject of my thoughts. The sight of his strong face and quiet eyes had an immediate effect upon me, and I grew calmer again. His very handshake was a sort of tonic. But, as I listened eagerly to the deep tones of his reassuring voice, and the visions of the night-time paled a little, I began to realize how very hard it was going to be to tell him my wild, intangible tale. Some men radiate an animal vigor that destroys the delicate woof of a vision and effectually prevents its reconstruction. Chapter was one of these men. We talked of incidents that had filled the interval since we last met, and he told me something of his travels. He talked, and I listened. But so full was I of the horrid thing I had to tell that I made a poor listener. I was forever watching my opportunity to leap in and explode it all under his nose. Before very long, however, it was borne in upon me that he too was merely talking for time. He too held something of importance in the background of his mind, something too weighty to let fall till the right moment presented itself. So that during the whole of the first half hour, we were both waiting for the psychological moment in which properly to release our respective bombs, and the intensity of our minds' actions set up opposing forces that merely sufficed to hold one another in check and nothing more. As soon as I realized this, therefore, I resolved to yield. I renounced for the time my purpose of telling my story, and had the satisfaction of seeing that his mind, released from the restraint of my own, at once began to make preparations for the discharge of its momentous burden. The talk grew less and less magnetic, the interest waned, the descriptions of his travels became less alive. There were pauses between his sentences. Presently he repeated himself. His words clothed no living thoughts. The pauses grew longer, then the interest dwindled altogether and went out like a candle in the wind. His voice ceased, and he looked up squarely into my face with serious and anxious eyes. The psychological moment had come at last. "I say," he began, and then stopped short. I made an unconscious gesture of encouragement, but said no word. I dreaded the impending disclosure exceedingly. A dark shadow seemed to precede it. "I say," he blurted out at last, "what in the world made you ever come to this place, to these rooms, I mean? They're cheap, for one thing," I began, "and central, and—" "They're too cheap," he interrupted. "Didn't you ask what made 'em so cheap?" It never occurred to me at the time. There was a pause in which he avoided my eyes. "For God's sake, go on, man, and tell it," I cried, for the suspense was getting more than I could stand in my nervous condition. "This was where Blount lived so long," he said quietly, "and where he died. You know, in the old days, I often used to come here and see him, and do what I could to alleviate his—" He stuck fast again. "Well," I said with a great effort, "please go on faster." "But," Chapter went on, turning his face to the window with a perceptible shiver, "he finally got so terrible I simply couldn't stand it, though I always thought I could stand anything. It got on my nerves and made me dream, and haunted me day and night." I stared at him and said nothing. I had never heard of Blount in my life, and didn't know what he was talking about, but all the same, I was trembling, and my mouth had become strangely dry. "This is the first time I've been back here since," he said almost in a whisper, "and, 'pon my word, it gives me the creeps. I swear it isn't fit for a man to live in. I never saw you look so bad, old man." "I've got it for a year," I jerked out with a forced laugh. "Signed the lease and all. I thought it was rather a bargain." Chapter shuddered and buttoned his overcoat up to his neck. Then he spoke in a low voice, looking occasionally behind him as though he thought someone was listening. "I, too, could have sworn someone else was in the room with us. He did it himself, you know, and no one blamed him a bit. His sufferings were awful. For the last 2 years he used to wear a veil when he went out, and even then it was always in a closed carriage. Even the attendant who had nursed him for so long was at length obliged to leave. The extremities of both the lower limbs were gone, dropped off, and he moved about the ground on all fours with a sort of crawling motion. The odor, too, was—" I was obliged to interrupt him here. I could hear no more details of that sort. My skin was moist. I felt hot and cold by turns, for at last I was beginning to understand. "Poor devil," Chapter went on. "I used to keep my eyes closed as much as possible. He always begged to be allowed to take his veil off, and asked if I minded very much. I used to stand by the open window. He never touched me, though. He rented the whole house. Nothing would induce him to leave it." "Did he occupy these very rooms?" "No. He had the little room on the top floor. the square one just under the roof. He preferred it because it was dark. These rooms were too near the ground, and he was afraid people might see him through the windows. A crowd had been known to follow him up to the very door and then stand below the windows in the hope of catching a glimpse of his face. But there were hospitals. He wouldn't go near one, and they didn't like to force him. You know, they say it's not contagious, so there was nothing to prevent his staying here if he wanted to. He spent all his time reading medical books about drugs and so on. His head and face were something appalling, just like a lion's. I held up my hand to arrest further description. He was a burden to the world, and he knew it. One night I suppose he realized it too keenly to wish to live. He had the free use of drugs, and in the morning he was found dead on the floor. 2 years ago, that was, and they said then he had still several years to live. Then, in heaven's name, I cried, unable to bear the suspense any longer. Tell me what it was he had, and be quick about it. I thought you knew, he exclaimed, with genuine surprise. I thought you knew. He leaned forward and our eyes met. In a scarcely audible whisper, I caught the words his lips seemed almost afraid to utter. He was a leper. You've been listening to The Listener by Algernon Blackwood. If you enjoyed tonight's narration, consider subscribing to Midnight Murmurs for more classic ghost stories, forgotten horrors, and public domain tales brought back to life. Leave a comment and let me know what story you'd like to hear next. Until next time, sleep well, and if you wake in the middle of the night, don't answer the listener.